Today on D2C Diaries, we're doing a mastermind breaking down how we are using Claude right now across creative strategy. And this is by far our most asked for mastermind. Now, as we know, the AI ecosystem has fundamentally shifted in the last 6 months, and a lot of people haven't necessarily caught up. Platforms are very much racing to commoditize execution. Now, what that essentially means is there needs to be more focus on strategic depth. So the problem is most people jump into using Claude Code, or they build pointless web apps that really don't have a business case, right? So today we are walking through the end-to-end process of all of this. So we're going to be looking at why context is the entire game right now and why your prompts matter less than you think. How to build Claude skills that compress your team's best thinking into systems that can actually run and drive better results for your clients as well. So I'm going to be showing you exactly under the hood how we build our script writing skills, as well as reporting and script QC skills as well. We're also going to talk about what unlocks when you stack skills and context fundamentals with Claude Code. So that's the agentic layer where things stop being chat and start being real infrastructure that can compound at scale. We're going to look at how structuring AI inside of creative strategy department looks right now. And also the part I'm really excited about is looking at the bespoke operating system that we've built for my brand, and also that we are, integrating into our agency and all of our brand accounts. This is a compounding self-learning intelligence layer that started as a junior strategist, but through giving feedback to it and also implementing systems that allow us to easily log reasoning traces and strategic decisions, it now acts like a senior strategist. So whether you are new to your journey using Claude or you think you're advanced, we will cover the end-to-end fundamentals in today's session to help you succeed in the next chapter of ecom. So without further ado, let's get in. Now, we create over 6,000 ads a month across high production, UGC and static. So utilizing these tools effectively has become even more important, not only to ensure that we can kind of remain efficient and, reduce our cost per creative, but also to ensure that we are using these systems in a way that can actually improve the performance and the output of the stuff that we are doing. And also, as I like to describe it, we break tasks now into points of leverage, right? So we've got low, medium and high leverage. So maybe like static scripting, once you've got your concepts or, building the brief of a static ad, is pretty low leverage now, right? Now, that isn't me saying statics aren't important, but if you've provided the right inputs and the system has the right context to be able to do that as effectively as you, that then means that you as a creative strategist have so much more time to focus on the higher leverage stuff, which is things like research, strategy, etc., etc. So that is why utilizing these tools effectively is not only important, but it's essential, because if you don't, you will be left behind.
Quick question. How many tabs do you have open right now to manage your business expenses? There's your bank, your expense tracker, your ad account, some spreadsheet, maybe even an AI companion to help you make sense of the chaos. If that sounds familiar, Incard has the solution. Incard is the financial platform built for how modern businesses actually operate. Multi-currency accounts, corporate cards, and a fully connected banking experience all in one place. It replaces chaos with one connected system. And I mean actually connected. Shopify, Xero, Meta, all in one view, all in one dashboard. You earn cashback on the things that you're actually spending money on. Think Saas, travel, ad spend, the exact costs that eat into your margin every month. And brands like Azio Beauty and Aloe Paris are already using it to scale smarter. So check out Incard through the link in the description below. And back to the episode.
Now, we've gone through this kind of pretty huge shift over the last kind of 6 to 12 months. And this shift is very much around the idea that AI is soon going to commoditize execution. And that's kind of coming into some of the stuff that I just mentioned then. And replacing those low leverage tasks with high leverage thinking is going to become more and more important. Now, we run a service-based business. This is going to become less about providing a service to a client in return for some, for a retainer fee. It's going to be more about outcome-based pricing. So people are going to be paying for an outcome. And if they're paying for an outcome, we need to be a strategic partner, not an execution partner. So that's why the focus is going to become more on things like strategy, QC, and prioritization. So what you'll know by the end: why our context forms the basis of using Claude effectively, how to create Claude skills and use them to accelerate your work, the capabilities of Claude Code and Claude Skills combined. So we're going to actually run you through, what we are doing from an operating system standpoint. Once we have the foundations and basics of not only context, but also skills and agents. Also how we're structuring AI within creative strategy, so how we're thinking about this, and then function builds that live inside the brain. So some of those builds we're going to be going through as well with you. Now, I think some of the mistakes made, and I touched on this at the start, is like diving into things like code and, too quickly and without understanding the fundamentals. Because one, if you're building architecture in the wrong way, it is likely going to break. But also style over substance. What is the business case? What is the KPI that we are attaching to this feature or this build that is going to either drive better performance or build efficiencies with our process? So it's important that you are tracking improvements against a KPI or a benchmark. When you build something, how are we tracking the performance of that build? So before we get into any of this, the absolute fundamentals or basics is context, is context engineering. Now we went through this, progression of starting with prompt engineering, where it's essentially just you inputting a prompt. Then we moved to context engineering, which is actually more about speaking to the context and providing enough context so the output is strong enough. And that's why this is so important, right? And the problem with prompt engineering that we see is that it's kind of like, in the way I like to describe it is, it's like a lecturer within a business school. They've never been an entrepreneur themselves. They've never actually run a business, but they've just studied business. Now, this is what I feel like prompt engineering is, when you're just asking the LLM a question and expecting a response. They're going to be tapping into their own context that they may have from, a vast range of domain inputs through the World Wide Web. Now, they don't actually understand the context, the domain and business context that we have to be able to get the best possible outcome. Because AI, without, you giving it the right inputs, is blind to things like performance data, customer language, internal insights, nuances, etc., etc. And the gap is you as the individual have the intelligence, and it's your responsibility to provide AI with that. They've got the processing power, we've got the intelligence. You can't use either individually. We need to compound and bring those two together. So the two types of context that you need to be thinking about, and it is super important that you are, because as AI, becomes more and more important and integrated into what we do, it becomes even more important that everything within your brain is being downloaded in a way or formed in a way of broken into one of these two categories: brand context or domain context. Now, brand context is everything such as the products we sell, who we buy for, it's the brand identity documents to really understand the tone of voices, the USPs, how we speak to our customers. It's the reviews, so the live reviews that we are seeing all the time on our website. It's the top performing ads, the data, what is working right now. That is all of the context from your brand that makes it bespoke. Domain context is more from a wider industry perspective or skill point of view. So that could be industry best practices related to, in this case, creative strategy. It could be how to write incredible scripts. It could be best performing static ads. So that could be, if you're an agency owner, you could have 50 static ads that have worked well across multiple accounts. If you're a brand, it could be your top performing 30 static ads and a breakdown of why they worked. Similarly with HighProd, UGC, etc. Now, these aren't necessarily, these are more kind of broad-based pieces of domain context that uncover patterns in those best performers. So rather than like, brand specific context, which is related to the data, these frameworks are more looking at, okay, here are a lot of the things that are working right now within the market, and let's hypothesize why those are working, because that is great context that AI can use to enrich and enhance its outputs. And the final one could be things like hooks. So how to make great hooks. If you give domain context to AI in terms of how to write great scripts, but maybe not hooks, then it's not going to really understand the fundamentals of how to really capture attention. So breaking that down, and this is an exercise that I recommend you doing if you haven't done already. We break context, as I say, into domain and brand, and that it kind of breaks into, from a domain perspective, external learnings and insights, and internal knowledge. Now, I get asked all the time, well, what if I don't have the expertise around creative strategy to really train a model or provide a context document on what internal how to do that really, really well. Now, the good news is you can go to things like YouTube, Twitter, LinkedIn. There are endless resources and articles that you can use that is going to help enrich your context on how to do things super, super well. A great example is someone like Sarah Levenger on Twitter, right? She does these incredibly long 2,000-word blog posts about hyper-specialized parts of creative strategy. So one could be how to increase your incremental reach, as an example. Now, if you take that article and ask your LLM to create a context document with that article, then it's going to do a really, really good job of doing that. Similarly, if you take one of our, a common example actually is a script. We've got a script writing context doc. Now, script writing is something that, again, is very nuanced. What works, what doesn't. Now, I did a whole mastermind on D2C diaries. We'll put the link down below, which breaks down how to write great ad scripts or storytelling in script writing. Now, you could literally take that video, transcribe it, or take the transcript, put it into AI, and ask it to turn that into a context document, giving it very clear objectives or what the ideal outcome of that context document is. Now, this is what you need to start doing in every skill or every part of the domain expertise required to do a job well, because that is what is going to drive to better outcomes. Now, from a brand perspective, that could be things like, downloading your best performing ads. It could be internal SOPs, data, processes, documents. Now, that is the stuff that you already have and is quite easy to find. Now, what we used to do is actually organize all of this context into something called a context library database. So this is something that we have, but as we will talk about later, we don't require anymore with our new setup in our operating system. But I would recommend doing this as an absolute step one, because if you've got a document like this that breaks down the different context that you require, then what that means is when you're building skills, you can cherry pick and tap into different things for different skills. So for an example, if you're building a script writing skill, that means we can use the storytelling and script writing 101 context document, why losing scripts don't write, script writing theory, how to make great hooks, or hooks 101. We could also pull in the high prod best performers, UGC best performers, etc. And it will be able to create skills quite easily because you've given it the context to do so. The great thing with Claude, when you build skills within Claude, is that you can ask it to help you build the logic of what context to tap into at what stage of the process to avoid something called context bloat. Now, before you understood that AI needed context, you'd essentially copy and paste brand docs, etc. But now you can productize your expertise and then you can deploy it infinitely. So that is why I'm super, super bullish on logging every decision that I make in the business, a strategic decision, because my operating system will start to learn how and why I make certain decisions, which is super, super exciting. But let's just take a step back now that we understand context and the importance of context and some of the things that we're going to be building today. But how do we get here? So it was very much this shift from kind of chat to agent to some degree, which meant that, there was accelerated reasoning, which essentially is the subconscious reason why we make certain decisions, coding capabilities now as well, and also agentic tool calling, which I think is really exciting and something that we have all been waiting for a long time. Now, what has kind of happened over the last 3 to 6 months? Now, as we can see, we have introduced Claude Opus, which is a top scoring LLM, which on coding and debugging. It has a huge context window. And if you don't know, like how we would describe a context window is like, imagine a piece of paper. You can only write a certain amount of words on that piece of paper. If you write more words on it, it won't be able to actually log or remember that. So it's essentially the memory in which we can hold before we start to blow or that memory, or it starts having to compress. So the bigger the context window, the more memory the LLM will be able to store, and as a result, the outputs will be much stronger. It's also more cost effective, and it has more better and more intelligent reasoning as well. Then came Claude Code, which was a poorly named terminal-based coding agent. It understands and writes entire code bases, so it can actually, just by you speaking to it in layman's terms, it's able to fully manage a terminal-based coding agent, and as a result, it will be able to create code that could translate into the likes of a web app, etc. So it's super exciting, some of the stuff that it can do. And the great thing is it can do all of that while you sleep. So if you give it a clear brief of what it needs to do, it can go away and do that. And by, within a few hours, you can have a whole system built, which again is really interesting. And Claude Code will tap into things like the context we discussed. It will tap into things like skills, dependent on what you are trying to get it to do. Then came Claude Skills, which essentially is a folder of repeatable knowledge. So you are essentially training Claude to be able to do one task really well with a desired outcome of that task. So that could literally be a reporting skill. So you could train it to go in and actually create a report for you. You could get it to write really great scripts, and why it's great is because it's super directional, and it uses logic to be able to tap into context at the right time, which is, if you're thinking about like a ChatGPT bot, what that used to, a custom bot, you would just upload loads of context documents, but there was no logic in terms of when to tap into those context documents at what time. So by doing it this way, it's much more directional, and means that if it needs to tap into more domain context first about, okay, what is a creative strategist, and then tap into how to write a great script, then depending on what your input is, so let's say it's a UGC script over a hyperprod or static, it won't need to touch any context related to hyperprod or static. It can just go very focused and directional into UGC context. So that's the kind of logic that it will build as a result of the inputs that you provide it. The next is Claude Cowork. So essentially, Claude Cowork is the same as code, but it doesn't require necessarily a terminal experience. So it is much more user-friendly way of actually building something. But the difference is it's far less bespoke. So within Claude Code, you can hook it up to something like VS Code, which will allow you to actually build clear hierarchy and commands that ensures that we are building a fully fledged operating system that can be better utilized externally. There's less back and forth though with Cowork, and it is kind of like instructing someone, and it can tap into multiple different agents or sub-agents at a given time. Now, this, when we go past all of these, we are then at a point of a bespoke agentic OS system or operating system. And what this means is we can start actually building custom solutions for our business that truly learns how best to deliver on an outcome. So that could entail self-learning intelligence. So as a result, you could instruct the system how to do something better as it goes, or how to actually, log a piece of reasoning. So here's why we made a certain strategic decision, and it will be able to log that context, and then as a result, get better get better after that point. Now, if you were just doing that in Claude Cowork, it wouldn't quite be the same. Now, obviously, you could go back into the same Cowork chat and it will have memory, but that memory will eventually diminish over time, and as a result, it won't remember those things that we changed. One of these systems means that we can actually build a back-end data warehouse that logs data, live data at all times, context, decisions, and it is all centralized within one brain. The agents then, or the skills, live on top of that brain, so it can actually tap into that live context at a given point, and all of that compounds over time. This isn't an individual skill that does a singular task. It is a holistic system that essentially can, replace doing these things individually across lots of different platforms. So, just to get started on Claude Skills before we get into that other stuff. Now, I'm going to talk through how we actually built our script writing skill as a clear example. Now, a skill is broken into two parts. So you have the skill MD, which essentially is like the brain. It's the routing logic. So, for example, as I used an example earlier, if our input is we want to create a UGC ad targeting this persona, it will know using routing logic that it should, yes, look at fundamental context across creative strategy and script writing, but then it will only tap into context relevant to UGC after that point. So, for example, our UGC frameworks. And then if we said to use a specific persona, it will only pull relevant persona information for that one versus all of our personas, because it doesn't need it. And therefore, if it was tapping into all of our persona context, then it would likely bloat in terms of its output. There's also format detection. So as I say, is this UGC or high prod? So it's very directional in terms of what it uses. There's clear rules and guardrails that we put in with a skill. So for example, you could tell it to, when I ask to deploy the skill, it will ask me for 3 key inputs, and I have to provide it with those inputs. One of those could be a link to a Notion document. So we use a Notion creative strategy operating system for each brand. So for example, it knows on the back end that as soon as I provide the Notion link, it will go into that Notion page. It knows where to find the brand DNA for the brand in question. It knows where to look at the latest report, and it does all of that before actually driving its output. So again, it's finding up-to-date context and it knows where to find it. So we are setting those rules within the skill. In terms of the second part of the skill is the reference files, the knowledge. That's the context that we have been discussing and building together. So that's the frameworks, the templates, the best practices. When you build skills and you've already got these context documents ready to go, we can actually ask Claude or have a conversation with Claude and say, okay, what based on the outcome or the objective of this skill, what context documents or reference files do you need to give the best possible output? And you can actually have a conversation with it to actually build those things properly. So that is super, super exciting that, even if you don't have that experience or expertise building a skill, Claude really helps you through it. Like, it's super, super user friendly. Now, your stack for, that we have been using as a V1 for a lot of our skills. Now, as I said, we now have an operating system that we use across all of our client accounts, which is a fully bespoke, custom intelligence system that is self-learning over time. Now, you don't need to do that as a V1. Like, a V1 very much should be, how can I start using these tools in a way that's going to drive better outcomes for performance, but then also efficiencies. And building a fully fledged, all bells and whistles system is not necessary from day one. We've only just started doing that. We've been using skills for over 6 months, and actually it isn't really required until you reach that kind of next level. But the first one I would recommend from a creative strategy perspective is having within Notion or wherever you can build these things, is having a CSOS. So essentially, this is one dashboard on Notion that is your single source of truth. So ours looks something like this. It essentially has right now what the primary growth objectives are. It has up-to-date blended KPIs. So what is the benchmark? How are we performing against that benchmark? That is the North Star that whenever we are tapping into these skills, it can go into the CSOS relating to that brand, and it already has that context that it requires. We also have all of the strategic reports that we build for our brands. Now we've got a skill that automatically uploads these into this database for each of our brands. So that again is automated to some degree, but you can do it manually. But I'd recommend having a database within your CSOS on Notion that has those reports baked into it. Because as I said, you can instruct things like the script writing skill to actually go in and read the latest reports. It has all of the latest insights. And as a result, it might tweak its output as a result of that. We also have our persona banks. So obviously, if you haven't, go back and watch our persona mastermind, but this will include all of our personas and then the micro personas. So if I clicked open on that, it would have a massive breakdown of who that persona is, what their fears, their desires, their motivations are. So again, if we're building a script writing skill and I say, let's use P1.1, it just goes into the CSOS. It reads the primary growth objectives, the strategic thesis, it pulls that persona information, and as a result can speak on behalf of that persona. It also has things like awareness level splits, persona splits, just relating to our creative strategy. But this is the single source of truth. And if you have a Notion that keeps this all updated, you can quite easily build skills in a way that you can set rules that tap into different things when you require them. And that is the single source of truth. Now, we're going to provide an actual template for this that you can take away or use if you aren't already building, say, operating systems. And I definitely recommend doing this if you are running creative strategy for yourself or someone else. The other one is framework database. So now we've also got this built into our kind of web app or operating system that automatically pulls frameworks. But if not, one, you can build an automation to do this quite easily where it pulls best performers into Notion directly, or you can just do it manually using a VA or something like that. So we did this manually for a long time before it was possible doing it, without manual inputs. But essentially, this maximizes your unfair advantages as a brand or as an agency, right? You have best performers, you have lots of frameworks that you need to be logging and logging a hypothesis of why they worked. And you need to be logging them by ad type, funnel position, framework, and then obviously brand if that's relevant as well. Now, why this is super, super important is because, as soon as, for example, with a script writing skill, if you've got a whole framework bank of high prod UGC and statics, let's say, if you give the input within your skill, okay, let's use persona P1.1, we're going to use problem aware in the funnel, and I want you to actually go and pick a concept or a framework and give me a hypothesis of why you picked that. It will then go through its flow or its logic flow, where it will actually be able to directly pull go into your CSOS. It will be able to read the brand objectives. It will be able to look at the recent report. It will then, based on that report, go into your framework database and pick a framework that it thinks makes most sense based on where your data is right now. And it will obviously, you've given it a funnel position as well. So you've given it some constraints. So again, really great thing to do if you want to start executing at scale. And by your skill utilizing data, it can actually start picking ads that are working. Now, just a quick hack to be able to easily do this, just take your best performer, or if you don't have your own best performers, go to ads library or meta, and you can sort by highest impression videos. They are usually the best performing videos for your competitors if you go on highest impressions. I've tested this, it usually is pretty accurate. So That's what you want to do, and then download them. You want to then upload it to Gemini and say, Gemini, can you create me a framework breakdown of this exact script? I want the script breakdown, the visual description, the shot type, audio, etc. I also want you to give me a hypothesis of why this worked, and it will give you a hypothesis as well. Now, I also have a gem on Gemini, which has a bit of context on how to best hypothesize. So again, it has some context there on like what to pull, what information to pull, etc. But again, this is a super important part of your process. And once you do it this way, which I guess is the more manual approach, it's very easy down the line to then build this into an operating system. Because we had the approach already built out previously, it meant when we then built this into an actual web app, it was quite easy to do that. So what that workflow looks like from a skill building perspective. The skill MD, as I said, it's the orchestrator. It defines the phased workflows, the decision points, the input, outputs, etc. You've got your reference files. That's the knowledge base, the context. It taps into those at the right time, depending on how we build that skill or what the ideal outcome of that skill is. We have the Notion integration. So MCPs, you can build these in essentially like API connectors into different tools. It can, we can do the same with Ads Manager, but you can actually integrate Notion and set up a connector in Claude. So just with the Notion link, it can go into Notion and find what it needs to with the right rules. Then we have quality gates. So we set these for every brand, which essentially is like, we have a QA step which has a checklist that it kind of that it runs itself through to make sure the output is in line with the standards that we have set the skill. So that's something that I would recommend also including in your workflow builder. Cool. Now let's run through the script writing skill and the exact flow of logic that we follow, and also the rules that we set to make this skill really, really strong. So what's super exciting about this, we go into multiple layers, right? So we aren't just looking at this from the perspective of, create me a script for this type of person with this angle. We have the ability now to go much more in depth and look at psychological briefing as well. So we don't just look at funnel position, persona, framework, but we're also looking at things like valence zone and self-concept anchor. So as we know, valence zones 1 to 4, they are all different emotional states or psychological states in which we speak. And the reason why we want to diversify these emotional states, so let's say angry versus scared or disappointed or, empowered. And the reason we want to speak in these different states is because this is another layer that is going to really help drive incremental reach in the ad account. Sarah Levenger does a great article on this that we've spoken about in the podcast before. And actually the issue a lot of the time isn't that you don't have enough volume within the ad account, but it's just that you're getting in front of the same people because you're speaking in the same way within your ad creative. And as a result, Meta's Andromeda isn't able to pick up on the triggers that you put within your scripts that allows it to put itself in front of different people. Now, as we know, Andromeda is like the smartest librarian in the room. So it doesn't just know every book in the library, it also knows what is on every page in every book and every word on every single page. So that means it is incredibly talented at being able to get in front of the right person through the likes of, what we've described previously as soulmate theory, which means there's the perfect ad out there for every single person. Now, if we're speaking to everyone in the same way, then you're speaking to everyone, you're not speaking to anyone. So that's why layering in things like valence zone is also really important within your scripts. Now, what we did here is Sarah Levenger has a blog article where she talks about valence zones and also self-concept anchors and language intensity as well, and the importance of these. Now, this is a really in-depth article, and this is a great example of how we've used external domain context and then translated it into a context document for our own process. So we actually are able for the AI to go into our reports understand what's working and not, and pick up on those signals, and then pick a valence zone that it wants to put against a certain ad that we are producing. Now, we also do another thing called valence gap analysis within our reporting, which again is part of the skill, right? And utilizing Meta's API, where it can actually pull every single ad creative that is live in the ad account that has spent over £500. It can do an analysis of maybe where the gaps are from a valence perspective, what emotional states we aren't speaking in. And then as a result, it can ensure that we are balancing out our creative strategy when we get into concepting. So our scripts are also speaking to those different valence zones. So I just wanted to give that, I guess, ballpark understanding of how that works before we get into, I guess, the meat of the actual system. Now, the outcomes of this is increased blended ad spend. So we are seeing better ad spend through our creators within the ad account, as well as better, heightened hit rate, because it is able to be much more dialed in and ensuring that every decision that it makes is tied back to a hypothesis or is tied back to data. So that's really important. It also allows our creative strategists to be much more efficient. So I think they're about 20 to 30% more efficient now by using this skill, and also advanced psychological depth. So I just ran through an example of that in terms of how we can tap into valence zones and speak to different people in different ways, because it is able to pick up on those signals and adapt our messaging accordingly, which is super, super important.
Quick question. How many tabs do you have open right now to manage your business expenses? There's your bank, your expense tracker, your ad account, some spreadsheet, maybe even an AI companion to help you make sense of the chaos. If that sounds familiar, Incard has the solution. Incard is the financial platform built for how modern businesses actually operate. Multi-currency accounts, corporate cards, and a fully connected banking experience all in one place. It replaces chaos with one connected system. And I mean actually connected. Shopify, Xero, Meta, all in one view, all in one dashboard. You earn cashback on the things that you're actually spending money on. Think Saas, travel, ad spend, the exact costs that eat into your margin every month. And brands like Azio Beauty and Aloe Paris are already using it to scale smarter. So check out Incard through the link in the description below, and back to the episode.
Cool. Now that we've gone through that, I'm going to actually just give you a very, very top level view of actually what the 8 phases are of this strategic report skill. So you can go, not strategic report, script writing skills. So you can see the process in which we go through a little bit under the hood, that you can go away and take some of these elements and fundamentals and build them into your own skills. So as I said, the things you'll need for this is your Notion CSOS. Now, as I say, that's if you don't necessarily have a custom built operating system yet, but it does exactly the same job essentially, as long as you give it the right rules of what to tap into at what point. Reference files, so it will actually, that's your context document, so it knows when to, based on logic, when to lean into those reference files at different points. Inputs, so what are the inputs that it requires to know what to go and do? Because obviously based on certain parts of logic, it will only do certain things if you tell it to. So for example, if you're creating a UGC, you need to tell it you are, because otherwise it's not going to pull the right context, because there's some very directional context that are related to just UGC ads or UGC best performers, which it will tap into if you tell it that, versus looking into high prod UGC and static, and then as a result of that, it bloating its context with a lot of information that it doesn't require. The only information it needs should be surfaced, essentially. The output, so that's what it will send back to us at the end. The decision points, so there are certain points where it might stop and ask for decisions. We've got a few modes that we're going to go through with you that we set up within this skill. We have quick mode and calculated mode. Quick mode is it just goes through the whole process end to end and gives us a script. Calculated, it acts more like a creative strategist, maybe your assistant, right? And you're having to sign off at each stage of the process, make sure you're happy with what it's doing. There are also QA gates that happen at the end of the skill, which means it is essentially putting itself through a checklist to make sure the script that comes out at the back end is good enough as it needs to be able to align with our standards, right? So the things that we will provide it, Our funnel position, so is it unaware to most aware? Where does it sit? Persona code, so that is, we just codify our personas because then it will know through the rules built into the skill MD that if I say persona 2.1, then it just goes straight to the CSOS. It pulls persona 2.1, it pulls the fears, the desires, the motivators, the breakdown of that persona, how we speak to it, and it will be able to extract that context to build into the script to ensure that it's really, really hyper focused on that. Because as we know with Andromeda, the more specific we are with persona, the better. That's how we're going to get in front of the right people. As well as I said, creative strategy, creative type. So is it UGC, hybrid, or static? Because again, we want to make sure it's getting in front of the right, getting the right context from the right bucket. We also ask the input of sending the CSOS link. So then AI knows exactly what brand we're working with and it can go in and find the relevant information. There's also optional inputs like angle. So again, if we wanted to be more specific about the angle that we wanted it to create a script for, we can tell it. Same with framework. Is there an exact framework that we want it to use? We can either link it from the framework database, or we can give it a concept description of what you're trying to achieve. And then obviously the execution mode I mentioned already, which is obviously quick or calculated mode here. So what happens in phase one once we've actually kind of given the input? So it reads the brand's creative strategy operating system from Notion essentially and extracts everything that it requires to build great scripts that are on brand and aligned to the data at that given point. So what it's going to do is go firstly into the CSOS, and the first piece of brand context it requires is, who is this brand? So we've got a brand DNA document. So it knows to go into that brand DNA document, it extracts who are the brand, what are their USPs, what are their do's and don'ts, what's the tone of voice, how do we speak to their customers, the benefits of the product, everything it needs to know to get a clear understanding of how to translate that into a script. So the first thing it will do is go into that brand DNA document and read that information. The second thing it will do is actually go into the strategic report. The next thing it will do is actually go into the persona bank. So that's why we've told it to persona P1.2. Then it just knows it can go directly into the persona bank and pull all the information it needs for P1.2. It can pull the right core fears and motivators, etc. The next thing it will do is go into the strategic report database within the CSOS, and it will pull the latest report that we built for that brand. Now, why this is great is because it's going to mean the data is super up to date, and it's pulling the right insights and translating that into our scripts. So it's actually using that data to hypothesize why it makes certain decisions with the script, and it will tie every decision it makes back to that data. Now, this is a great example of why you need context for different parts of the process. So we've had to provide reference file that tells the skill how to understand data and benchmarks. So it understands CTR, CVR, TSR, hold rate, CPAs, etc., etc. It knows the benchmarks it knows obviously the soft metric benchmarks. It knows if you've got low TSR, what the reasons might be. It knows what you can do to enhance that TSR off the back of it. So again, it not only is reading the data, but understanding and articulating what that means in the form of a hypothesis. So now it's gone on and pulled all of those things. The brand DNA document, it's pulled the persona code and the breakdown of that persona, and then it's also pulled the strategic report. So it's done all of those things, and we've provided the brief inputs to allow it to do so. We've decided on a quick or calculated mode, so it actually does this one and then obviously pulls those relevant bits accordingly. Then once it's got all of that information and it's followed the right paths of logic, because it only needs certain pieces of context at certain times to ensure that its own narrative and understanding is correct. Like if you think about yourself as a creative strategist, let's say, you try to understand things in different layers in your own head. So if you're looking at a report as an example, you're going to look firstly at like the wider brand objectives, which is the North Star, and then kind of trickle down into the bits that fall below that, which are essentially different layers. But if you did that in different orders, then it would confuse you and it wouldn't make sense. So that's why it's important. The flow of logic is key. So phase 3 is it loads in domain context. So there's some always loaded reference files that it will go through that are super important for a scriptwriter, which is the creative strategy MD. So this is our philosophy to script writing, how to make great scripts. How to, the fundamentals of creative strategy, storytelling fundamentals, how to make great storytelling within ad creative, how to craft the right pacing, how we tap into core human desires. We then have funnel positions. So it will read all of those funnel positions and what the nuances of those funnel positions are, but it will only tap into the context relevant to the funnel position it needs. So if we pick problem aware, it will go into that reference file, but only read the information it needs from problem aware, because otherwise its context is going to blow and it might potentially confuse the output. And these calibrate because then it means that, it's ensuring that it is some of those kind of fundamental domain things that we would always do with our scripts as someone who's a talented script writer. It then knows how to do those things at a really good level. So we've got past the phase 3, which is domain context loading. Phase 4 is psychological targeting. So valence zones is something that we use as part of our scripting now and approach. Sarah Levenger has a really good blog post on this on her Twitter. And this is a great example of like someone else has written something that's truly valuable that you want to utilize or implement or, enrich your skills. You can go and do that. So we did that exactly with this article that Sarah Levenger wrote about valence zones, self-concept anchors, and language intensity. So we just pulled that blog post, wrote a little bit more context about how it relates to our business. And then it created a reference file for that or context document that it could then use in this process. So that is like the valence zones, just to give you a very top level view, is like there's 4 kind of core zones. Those zones tap into different emotional states. So actually, like you could be running 1,000 ads and your incremental reach is declining, yet that might not be because you have an ad volume problem. It might be because you do have a diversity problem, a psychological diversity problem. Because as Meta say, Andromeda is the smartest librarian in the world, which means it doesn't just know every book in the library, it knows every page in that book and every word on those pages. It comes back to that idea of soulmate theory. If we aren't diversifying the emotional targeting within our creative, the Meta won't have the signals to put that in front of the right individual. So it's super important that we are diversifying our valence zones as a result of that. So one thing that we also do, just so you are clear as well, is we actually run reports that are just valence zone analysis. And it's the idea of it is a gap analysis where we use Meta's API. So it will download all of the ads. It will basically identify and analyze those ads in Gemini to see, okay, where are the gaps? Where does this ad place right now in valence? And then it will say you've only got 3 of your 500 ads that sit in zone 3, negative low arousal. And then as a result, we know that's an opportunity. That's a gap that we need to be tapping into with our scripts. So this is the process that it will take it through to identify what the psychological targeting of that script is. So just to give you like a top level view, as I say, we've given it the inputs, it's gone to the CSOS, it's pulled the brand DNA document, the personas, the strategic report, it's then gone through its domain context references to ensure that it understands storytelling and creative strategy. It then goes into its psychological targeting. It then goes into the framework database and picks the framework that it thinks makes most sense based on what the data is telling us, right? So That is why, having a framework database or some form of database that can be tapped into is really important, because now it will pick one of our framework databases that aligns most to the brand in which, to the ad in which we are trying to create. And it will give us a hypothesis of why it picked that framework as well. So, it will match to persona psychology. It will also ensure that it links back to data within the latest strategic report. It will then execute on that format. So, for example, if it's a UGC video, the last thing it will do is then look at UGC frameworks, because it will look at pattern recognition of those. So we have then, individual reference files for UGC, Hyperod, and Static, which break down how to make great UGC ads with examples and what made those ads great. Because again, that context is the final piece of the puzzle to then execute on the script that we need. So it's got all of that as well. And also this is where it would tap into hook mastery. So it will actually, understand how to make incredible hooks as well. And then we've also got one that is for losing scripts. So you can see there's a lot of logic here and a lot that it goes through before it actually creates the script. And then finally, script writing. So it will build it out for us in the table, as you see here below, and then do a quality check off the back of that. So it has 5 key gates and validation points that link to different checks, right? So I won't go too much into this today, but again, really bullish on QA with AI and, linking a certain level of standard that you want to see and ensuring that it is checking itself. Because if it sees something wrong, like for example, if it checks itself on hooks, goes back to our hook reference files and realizes that hooks aren't strong enough, then essentially it will change that hook accordingly if it doesn't check enough of our hook checklist. Cool. The next one is our reporting skill. So just to go through this is what I was talking to you before about how it will, and I'm not going to go too much into this one, but I want to show you how else you can be building skills without the need of building full end-to-end bespoke operating systems, is just by linking Meta's API. Make sure you're careful in the way that you do this and you get approved for it, because I've seen ad accounts get banned if they do this in the wrong way. But essentially, what we are able to do just by connecting Meta's API and creating a plugin, which essentially is like a selection of skills that lives within Cowork, or agents that also have different things that you can do within it and different links to APIs if we require to go into or connect to different tools. Just by us giving a few inputs. So what we do here is the inputs that for this skill that we need to give it when we call it within Cowork is say what the ad account ID is, a link to the CSOS, and any relevant context that it might need that might be specific to the last month. Now, you don't have to do that part, but we found it's quite valuable to say to the skill, yeah, this is something we've been testing over the last 30 days, because if that is the case, then it might start looking for those things in it, which I think is always interesting. So it is then able to, just from giving it those small inputs and the connection of Meta's API, it goes into the ad account, it pulls the top 30 ads within the ad account at that given time, it uploads them to Gemini, it analyzes all of those creatives to see what's working, what's not, and hypothesizing that, and essentially puts it into our strategic report template. It takes about 30 minutes end to end, and we are going through the process of iterating and improving that right now, but it's really, really good, and it saves huge amounts of time for the creative strategist. This is the example of the psychological heat map that we mentioned, where it will actually tell us, as you can see, this example here, there's a lot of ads that aren't being, there's a lot of parts that aren't being covered within that matrix. So for example, zone 3 and zone 4, that is going to tell the creative strategist that there's huge amounts of opportunity in zone 3 and 4. We need to speak to zone 3 and 4 within our ad creative in the next campaign. And the outcomes of this, we're saving about 2 days a month per CS, which is huge. That could go towards advanced research and strategy, which is massively high leverage. Advanced reporting depth. So it has the time to do things like the gap analysis that we personally wouldn't have time to do, and also advanced psychological depth as well. So another example of how, these skills can be used and the value of these skills. Now, the third one is our grading skill. So this again is, like, I've touched on this briefly already, but we essentially are able to grade every script that we do. So, for example, where I've seen real value in this one is if you have new creative strategists that join your business, or you're trying to get maybe more junior people to start scripting in your business, you might have a skill that you've provided them, but they don't know what good looks like, right? They don't know how to QC that properly. So we've created a skill that allows them to QC their own work. And why that is great is because it increases the impact of those scripts. So it also, reduces management QC. So if you're, a senior strategist or a leader in your business, you don't have time to be reviewing every single script. So it massively reduces time spent there from a management point of view. And I've personally seen that this has really helped improve strategists and upskill them, because it teaches them things maybe they didn't see. For example, we talk about valence zones and speaking to different psychological states. AI is really good when you tell it to be able to know if you are jumping between different valence zones or speaking in different psychological states. So, it's a great way of you actually not maybe being able to see that as a strategist, and it telling you to, and you've learned something off the back of that. So it's a great way of really heightening not only the quality, but also ensuring that the strategist is learning something from that. So I'm not going to stay on this for long, but just to show you then how that works from the perspective of the grader. It will firstly load all of the context, the relevant stuff that it requires. So the script, obviously we need to give it the script that it's reviewing, where it sits in the funnel, the persona code, the creative type as well. We can also share optionally, if we want to, things like the CSOS. So if it wants to get, a little bit more of an understanding of the brand, it can do that. But it will, the good news is, because we're giving it the CSOS, if you give it the persona code, it's actually going to go in, find the persona code, and actually, review whether we've spoken to that script in the way that the persona in which we're looking to target would. So it would identify things like that. It would then load the reference files, so the funnel positions, 3 dimensions, which is the psychological states, losing scripts, hook mastering, storytelling fundamentals. And then it goes into this weighted funnel, essentially, where it will have a criteria on 10 different areas, and it will score those out of 10. So it will look at thumb stop power, persona recognition. As I said, it will link it back to the original persona. Are we super clear who the persona is here? Because one thing I've noticed is the scripts or the ads that do the best are the ones that very clearly are targeting one persona. That comes back to the soulmate theory I spoke about earlier. Valence zone consistency. So are we staying consistent to the valence zone? Storytelling and narrative arc. Curiosity loop architecture. So are we using curiosity loops in our ads? Language authenticity, emotional depth. Funnel alignment. So are we, depending on the funnel that we've said we're creating this ad for, is that actually true? Does that translate? Trust signals. So are there enough trust signals within the creative that are going to drive things like CTR? And then CTA and conversion architecture. So is there clear risk reversals? Are we, super clear about what the viewer has to do next to go and buy the product? So as you can see, it will actually score each of these and give it the hard floor is an 8 out of 10. So it will not be a pass if it's under an 8 out of 10. But really, we want to be looking for a weighted average of over 9 out of 10 to be able to go and say, okay, yeah, go and run this ad now. So that's just something to keep in mind as well. So it will actually score each of those, give it a blended score overall. And then the great news is it will actually then give you a report and say, this is what you need to go and do to improve on this script. So it will diagnose, prioritize. It could rewrite it for you or say to you, do you want to rewrite it? It will then rescore it for you, compare it against the original, and then if it needs to repeat it, it can. So it almost has this perfect feedback loop of based on those inputs, it will know where to prioritize changes and why, and then it will rerun it for you and give you the output as a result. So the final output is essentially the improved script and giving clarity of why it made those certain changes so you can learn as well. It's not just doing it and not giving you that context. So with our army of skills and I guess, context and understanding of how the fundamentals work, that's where you can start looking at building real operating infrastructure in your mix. And, we're doing this right now with with Saas. So we've created a control room, which essentially is is where we store all of our data. It's where we warehouse all of our data across our client accounts. It is the centralized anchor in which we work from and build infrastructure on top of to be able to achieve our clients' goals. So, we can actually build forecasts within this. We can actually build reports. It has agents that do different things, all because it is layered towards that back-end data warehouse. And the outcome is really positioning us as a core strategic partner. And this is a sticky product that is going to compound with value over time. The other one is I've created a CSOS for Club Neuro, which is my brand. So essentially, this does lots of different things, this CSOS. It does exactly the same thing as the control room that I mentioned to you before. So it's fully back-end data warehouse. And, why this is so valuable is because from an architecture standpoint, this is an intelligence engine, right? It becomes my co-pilot. It not only stores data as we go, but it compounds reasoning and self-learning intelligence at scale. So it becomes an incredibly strong creative strategist. And I'll walk you through maybe what that looks like. So it has a co-pilot built into it like this, as you can see. So it can speak directly to the data at all times. So, I could say to it, give me a comparison report of Persona 1 and Persona 2. Which of these two are we seeing driving the highest AOV as an example? Or give me some insights in terms of where we're seeing strongest blended soft metrics for each persona breakdown and what are the opportunities? What were our NCPAs over the last 30 days? I could speak directly to the data and it will be able to consolidate and give me that information back. We've then also got a creative strategy tab here. So we've got an overview, which essentially breaks down blended soft metrics. We've also got a creative strategy tab, which essentially is like where we set our creative strategy. So where we set funnel positions for every month, creative type splits, persona splits, angle splits. And the great thing about it is there's a back-end reasoning trace log that is attached to it, which means every single decision I make gets logged on the back end. And as a result, it enriches its learning and context as a result of that, which I'll get into in a moment. We've also, as you can see, built the best performance database into this. So whenever a creative hits £1,000 in spend minimum, it automatically downloads the ad, it uploads it into the best performance database here. It will hypothesize why the ad works and it will store the framework. So then similarly, if I'm in Copilot and want to go into scripting, it will be able to use the scripting agent and it will have all of that context in terms of the frameworks that are working. And also, it will consolidate all of the hypotheses from all of the ads that we've created and look for those patterns. And as a result, that is going to enrich the context and drive better outputs on the Copilot here as well. We also have that for hooks. So every hook that exceeds 30% TSR, it will pull that hook, turn it, hypothesize why it worked. It will break down what we saw in the visuals, what the hook actually said. We also have a competitors tab, which is an always on spying tool that looks at any new ads that come into a competitor's ad library that hit a certain level, a benchmark of impressions. If it does that, then it will pull that framework again into the competitors tab and hypothesize why it works and turn it into a framework. We also have an audience research tab, which does a similar thing where essentially it will be able to scrape Reddit at all times. I've given it certain keywords to target. And if anything new pops up in Reddit that are opportunities that maybe we have missed that have linked to messaging, angle, persona, after stay, any of these kind of elements that make up an ad creative, then it will identify that as an opportunity and turn it into a strategic opportunity for me. Reports, which essentially is like a one-click strategic report build. So as I've said in the reporting skill, I built that reporting skill, so it was so easy to then build it into this operating system infrastructure. But I guess before we look at any of those, let's just look at the layers that make this up. So it's essentially a 4-layer brain that sits in a vector database in Supabase. So each layer feeds into the next. The Copilot is the surface, and it doesn't store anything strategic. It queries the warehouse and reads brand context from the file system, essentially. So what, in terms of what that looks like, on the bottom layer, we've actually got the raw unstructured data. So it is connected to things like Shopify, Klaviyo, Meta ads. It also has, actual raw, data in terms of context that is related to the brand, the personas, etc. The layer 2 is the reasoning traces. So essentially we have, and I'll get onto it in a moment, we have different buckets that fit into our reasoning. That means that depending on what I'm logging, it will make changes accordingly and as a result enrich its understanding of what it needs to do. And that will become clear in a moment. Then that feeds into the actual intelligence itself. So, okay, reasoning trace is, I guess, the why, but then what does that translate to in terms of how it does its job better moving forward? And that's the compounded learnings. And then finally, the function. So that's the features in which everything else runs through. So as I said, like a very top level view, we've got the framework and hook database, the reporting agent, the audience insight agent, the scripting agent, and the Copilot. All of this is speaking directly to that vector database in Supabase. And in terms of the reasoning traces, which I think is the most valuable part of this whole thing, and if there's one thing you're going to learn from the kind of operating system part of this talk, which obviously I'm not going to go into like the depth of how to build this on the back end. Comment below if you would want me to, but it would take way too long, and I think it would go over a lot of people's heads because it's just very nitpicky, essentially. But essentially, if there's one thing you're going to take away, it's this idea of reasoning traces. So reasoning traces, as I said, that's almost the thought that connects itself to a trigger that is a reason why we did something. So subconsciously, you make decisions every day, but actually, if you think about the reason why you made that decision, that is going to link to some form of trigger. Maybe it's a prior experience that you had that maybe that's the right thing to do. Maybe it's a piece of data. There's lots of signals in which a reasoning trace can link back to. And the strategic dashboard is essentially where, as I say, funnel positions, etc. sit. But every time we make a change in that strategic dashboard, then we have to log the reason why. So it pops up with a little box. So let's say we're on that page and it says problem aware, solution aware, etc., and is at like 25% each. And I want to increase solution aware. And the reason I want to increase solution aware is because we've had a signal in the ad account that suggests there's a lot of people comparing our product to another product. That would tell me that we need to do a better job of comparing us to other brands and why we are better. So as a result, I'm increasing solution aware in the mix. And it says, why do you want to log this reasoning trace? Why do you want to make this change? So it's asking for a decision, so it can log that decision. And I give it the reason. It then takes that and buckets that into strategic decisions that it then uses to enrich its own context and learning over time. So what this is like training, right? Like what we don't do enough of with AI is feedback and training it to become better. Treat it like an employee. 360 feedback loops are really important to enrich the system and its ability to understand how and why we make certain decisions. It's not going to have the nuances of knowledge and context that we might have until we train it to. You wouldn't have a new person join a business and not give them feedback on what they need to do better. Reasoning buckets. So essentially we bucket our reasoning into three different types: strategic decisions, hypothesis edits, and context rules. So we touched on strategic decisions briefly. I'm setting the strategic dashboard or the splits for the next month. It will ask me why. I will give it its reasoning. Whereas hypothesis edits, this again is really, really valuable. So as you know, we automate frameworks. So every time a framework hits £1,000 in spend in the ad account, it will, log it as a top spender, and it will download the ad, upload it, and turn it into a framework and a hypothesis as to why it worked. Now, when you first start doing that, even if you give it lots of context and information on how to analyze creative, it will likely not do it that well. So what I've done to enrich that context and make it better at what it does is actually I can make edits into that framework. So for example, and I'm just going to show you one now. So here's an example. Let's say this ad has just been pulled through. Here's a breakdown of why it worked. Here's the script framework. Here's the performance breakdown. Now, if I read this performance breakdown, I thought, it's a bit generic, it's not great, I would click edit here, make certain changes. Let's just say I do that because it will require reasoning. And then it will actually say before, after, and it will say, why are you making these changes? And the reason then we do that is because it will then come back and log it in the hypothesis edits, and then it will be able to hypothesize better next time. So it will enrich its understanding of how to actually read an ad and learn what's working and why, what the nuances of that ad are. And then it creates this compounding effect. It's like an A player employee when it's got the right guidance and context, and it will compound over time. So I didn't go into that loads, obviously, but I just wanted to give you a little view of how we're viewing this and using it in our own way. More will come on our control room, which is even more advanced than my Club Neuro operating system. I've done that just for creative strategy. But if there's one thing you're going to take from this final part that we've gone through, it is reasoning traces. Because, even when you use, there's models like, you've got obviously OpenClaw and these more agentic models that can go off and do their own thing, and they're much bigger context windows, and they're able to really store context and do lots of different things that even a skill wouldn't necessarily be able to go and do. The difference is, it still doesn't have the context or understanding of the nuances of you and your life. So this idea of reasoning traces and logging decisions to make the AI better at what it does is super important. You never just create something and it's the end state. And that's the same with skills. The skills are the exact same thing. You need to test those skills and improve them and tweak them and iterate on them, just like you do with your ads. So that's the one thing that I would say off the back of that. And then the final one that we are doing as well, which is working really well, is a static generator. So again, this would feed into the same operating system. It will feed into the same backend data warehouse. And essentially, it's able to pick a framework and it's able to go and create those ads accordingly. So it's this system to mass produce static ads at scale. And the inputs that this will need is framework. So what is the framework that we are using? The persona, because it needs to know specifics about that persona and how to speak to it. We can obviously add any copy if we want to, or we can keep it loose. And then essentially on the back end, it goes away. It pulls the relevant context of the persona and the brand DNA. So it knows, okay, here are the fonts, here's the copy, here's what I need to use for this ad. It has the framework, so a template of how to execute that static framework well. It then will take it to Claude, give it the framework template, give it the brand DNA information of your brand in question. So it knows, it has the colors, the fonts, etc., etc. And then it will essentially fuse the brand DNA with the framework. And then you've got a prompt that's ready to go into Nano Banana that, again, it does on the back end. It goes to Nano Banana with the prompt that you give it. It will actually take the product image of your brand. It has your colors, your fonts, your guidelines. It has the copy that it built itself in Claude, and then it will produce that ad for you. So the main things here, the other thing I didn't mention is that you can pick multiple different frameworks and 10 variations per. So you could just do with one click, 50 static ads. Now that will take probably 30 to 40 minutes to produce, but then obviously it actually loads it into this board section here, which essentially is just folders of whatever campaign number we're in. So if we're in CM2 for a brand, campaign 2, I've told it what campaign we're in, it will load them all within that system. Again, we've got reasoning traces logged into this. So if an ad is really off, I will give it that context of why it's off, and it's going to improve itself for next time. So that's just, again, I wanted to just give you a very quick rundown of how, when you've got the fundamentals in check, how you can then turn that into wider builds and operating systems that can enrich your whole way of working as a business, or in this case, creative strategy. So yeah, I hope you enjoyed that today. If you've got any questions, feel free to drop them down below. I know we went through a lot, and hopefully I didn't speak too quickly, but yeah, comment down below, Claude, and we will send you those reference files that we mentioned that's going to help you get started using a similar workflow to what we have done with the skills provided here.